Welcome back, everybody. Austin Hill Shaw here, founder of Creativity Matters and author of The Shoreline of Wonder on Being Creative. We are right in the middle of that space in between connecting with the world and affecting the world in a meaningful way, between the experience of insight and the manifesting of those insights. This is what we're exploring right now. And before we get into the definition of this and the fuller understanding, I thought it was important that we had a little bit of psychology, the psychology of creative awareness, because I think this is going to be really helpful in understanding and helping you to cultivate different ways of perceiving the world, of thinking about your own awareness and the awarenesses that you're engaging in while you are creating, okay? We've talked a lot about the different sorts of awarenesses, for example, between our sensorial body, our conceptual mind, and our trans-rational or non-ordinary spirit, right? And today I want to draw upon an understanding that comes out of something called the Perennial philosophy. And the Perennial philosophy was a movement that was started in the Middle Ages in Europe, whereby during all this time of fighting between different dogmas and ideas, there's a group of people who were wanting to look at the common threads of what unites these desires that people have. Why are people worshiping? Why are people assembling in congregations? Why? What is the commonalities between that? And out of that came some ideas that were made popular in a book by Aldous Huxley called The Perennial Philosophy. And really in it he was exploring again the sort of commonalities, the threads between all these religious and spiritual traditions. And so even though we're talking about psychology today and thinking a little bit about the mindset of how our creativity works in terms of the different sort of awarenesses it has, it stems back to this idea of the perennial philosophy. And again, it's perennial because it shows up in a lot of different traditions. In Buddhism, for example, this is a teaching known as the two truths, that there's an absolute truth and a relative truth. And we're going to start to see how that plays out, okay? So, first and foremost, in order to understand who we are on a really simple level, and this is, again, based on everything that you've learned already about creativity, okay, is that we, first and foremost, we have something that we call the self, okay? And the self has a capital S in front of it to denote that this is not the self that's at the top of your checkbook. This is not the self that sits on your name tag or on your business cards. This is not the self that is contained by a finite physical form. This self reaches outwards in unfathomable directions, okay? And it's hard for us to think about our lives in that way because we're primarily in another mode of being. But again, the experience of insight, that experience of opening up, is us actually opening up, removing the concepts for whatever reason, either intentionally or through circumstance, so that we can see this bigger view of our lives. And when we are in that sense of wisdom, and when we are in that primordial knowing before thought intervenes, we are engaging primarily with our self. Okay? Self was a term that was used by Carl Jung, who was one of the modern purveyors of psychology. And he really wanted us to understand us as human beings not only as just physical bodies, but expressions of archetypes, and that there's this thing kind of beyond that unites us all right? So that's a sense of a self. The self is kind of boundless. It's absolute in a way. It's an awareness that is infinite on some levels, okay? And I really think this is important to see it as such, because therein lies the potential of your creativity, right? There's an awareness of you that extends outwards in ways that you can't even imagine because it doesn't fit quite in the rational mind, all right? So, this experience of the self, this experience of the the absolute on some levels, is precisely what allows us to experience true creative insights, okay? Basically, an experience of insight, you can think about it, is a return to self. It's switching up of moving the self that's always there, but bringing it to the foreground and being like, whoa, okay? And you've all had that experience. You've all been in a place where suddenly your view on the world or your view on what's possible is way bigger than it was just what it was just a few moments ago, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, great. So, our self, our sense of infinite expanse, is balanced by what we would call the ego, the finite ego. The finite ego is what allows us to have a sense that I'm over here and that you're over there and that the world is out there, okay? The ego creates boundaries, right? And sometimes the ego has a bad rap. The ego, especially in spiritual systems, for example, meditators are often talking about, I need to transcend my ego, or I need to get beyond my ego, or I need to diminish my egoic desires on some levels, all right? Now, that's true on some levels. It's good to be able to transcend the ego at times so that we can have that experience of the absolute self. However, if we have no concept of an ego, or if we don't have a fully formed ego in place, or if it's absent altogether, we are technically, psychologically schizophrenic, okay? One who has schizophrenia cannot distinguish between where they end and the world begins. And it's a huge problem, all right? So we could say that mystics and meditators are trying to achieve this, but they still have some sense of where they end and where they end and the world begins. Whereas a schizophrenic is sort of caught in this self realm and can't distinguish between where they are and the rest of the world is. And that's a difficult way to be. There's actually a saying that says something like, the mystic and the schizophrenic are swimming in the same ocean, okay? Meaning they're in this sort of vast space of awareness. And yet, the mystic floats and the schizophrenic drowns. Does that make sense? Okay? So we rely upon the ego, and specifically the way in which we rely upon the ego in the creative process is because it allows us to manifest, right? It's the ego that can select the pen and pick it up and put it to the paper, right? It's the ego that is able to check the bank account and be realistic about that. It is the ego that is able to make discrete decisions. It is the ego that is able to analyze itself and say, this is a strength of mine. And also say, this is a weakness of mine. And look out in the world and say, that's a strength of that person, and that's a weakness of that person, and this is how we might work together, all right? That is incredibly valuable. You know, when you're working in teams, it's good to know what you can and cannot do, and to be realistic in the relative world about what we can and cannot do. So creativity, in some sense, is this curious mix between infinite possibility and reality, brick and mortar reality, right? That is what makes it so interesting to me personally, all right? Now, what we're doing at this point is we're moving into that between space between insights and manifestation, okay? And I want to show you how these start to work. Now, as you can see, I've drawn a circle here, and this circle represents the self, okay? And when I say the self, I say the big self, the absolute, okay? This is the big self, self with a capital S, all right? If I had the ability, I would make this huge, absolutely huge, okay? Down here, we have the ego, or in another way, the discrete individual, the contained individual, right? Like over here, I'm contained. I can say, well, according to my ego, my physical body, I end over here, and over there, I stop existing, right? Until I step over there. Does that make sense? So here's this vast awareness that is available to us, all right? This is the primordial awareness that is always already available. And then here is our ego, our ability to actually to do and undertake discrete movements. Now, the space in between the experience of insight and manifestation is what I call self-expression. So self-expression, in terms of it relates to this, is connecting with the world and affecting the world in a meaningful way at the same time. As it pertains to the psychology of creative awareness, self-expression is the absolute self being channeled through the individual and egoic identity into discrete movements and decisions and choices that are happening in real time. Does that make sense? Okay? Now, I want you to think about it in this way, all right? One of the best ways that we can perceive self-expression are through performers and performances. Not long ago, there was the Super Bowl. I can't even remember was playing, and I happened to be in Nicaragua, and I had a sense that I was going to go watch this event, and for some reason I messed up the time, and there happened to be a blackout there was a blackout in the Super Bowl, whichever one that was, and I got to this particular sports bar while the blackout was going on, and of course everybody's sort of waiting for the Super Bowl to go on, and so I'm checking my phone, and people are talking about, wow, what an amazing performance that Beyonce did, Beyonce the performer. And so I went online and looked up the YouTube video of it, and it's like, sure enough, it's like, here is one woman in the middle of tens of thousands of people here for this particular event. And there's just this sense of her owning the whole sense, right? Again, it's one finite individual, but what I would say she was doing, she was expressing what she was doing as a performer was allowing the big vastness of the energy, the felt sense of connectedness to be channeled through her finite body, her movements, and her singing. It was an incredible performance, and you can go to YouTube and check that out yourself. But that is an example of self-expression, but it can happen in all sorts of different ways. And it's really a time by which our minds start to work bilaterally, as they would say, where the so-called right brain, which is kind of connected more to the self, and this is really kind of a kind of a reductionist view on it. Like the right brain is so-called in balance with the left brain in real time. And you've all been in those experiences before. You've all had experiences in your life where suddenly you are doing things, but with an awareness which is much broader than you might imagine. Certain police officers at times of crises have reported a sense of slowing down with time when they've been in an armed conflict with somebody. They'll actually make note of everything seemed to slow down, and I could see things happening in a way that rationally doesn't seem to make sense. But that is a form on some levels of this self-expression of suddenly this big absolute way of seeing the world being mixed with our discrete movements. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in this next area, okay? Again, so this is just giving you a psychological overview of creative awareness. And again, it's based on not only psychology, but age-old philosophy, specifically the perennial philosophers, okay? If you want to know more, you can read Aldous Huxley's book on the perennial philosophy. I even wrote a section about it in The Shoreline of Wonder because I thought it was such an important concept, okay? And so helpful in understanding both the individual but the collective experience of creativity and how they kind of work together. So anyways, again, this is Austin Hill Shaw urging you to connect deeply, to make a difference, and to inspire creativity in others. And we're really going to see how that takes place when we combine, again, insight and manifestation in this in-between realm that I call self-expression. Okay, thanks. Let's get going. Thank you.